Well, hello, everyone. Not exactly the way I wanted to meet you. I was hoping to see you this morning, and unfortunately, woke up about 7:30 with no internet connection, and Xfinity said it would be fixed by 9:30. So I thought that would happen, and then it didn't. Then I panicked because I didn't have telephone numbers. I only had email addresses, and without my internet, I couldn't send you emails. So anyway, it turned out that it was best just to go ahead and cancel class. So my apologies to all of you all. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to record the class and send this to you. Feel free to ask any questions via email once you receive this, and then I'll respond back as well as I can. So first of all, for lesson 2 in the macro class, the master class in macro photography, let's look at your homework photos first. Just like I would have done in class this morning, I am going to cover your homework assignment. So I'll open Lynette's first. Here's Lynette's work. And I am going to go ahead and just open these all up. And I'm going to open them into Camera Raw so that they're a little bit bigger and you'll have a little bit better opportunity to see them. So Lynette did this little greeting card to all of you all first. And then here comes f7.1 using the 100 to 500 millimeter lens. And I think this one is zoomed all the way out to 500. By the way, you can look over my shoulder right over here where my cursor is, and this will give you the lens that was used and the f-stop that was used, and then what shutter speed also. So just in case you want to see that, it's right over there on the right-hand side. So this is 7.1 on the 500 millimeter lens. And by the way, that 500 millimeter lens, when you're at 100, it goes to one f-stop, and when you're at 500, it goes to another f-stop. And then here it is at f11, and you notice now that all of these little pollen-rich anthers are completely visible. So we've got nice depth of field on those. Good job on that one, Lynette. And then we come into F5, F51. Amazing. But you can see how much of the background we can now see. And then Lynette, you lost focus right in there. So your focus looks like it went in there on that water drop instead. And then here is Lynette's work again with the 14 to 35 millimeter lens. Nice sharp focus right here on those anthers again. And then you can see what a nice blown out background it has at 4.0, but not totally blown out. We can still see there's a house back there. And then F8. House is coming into a little bit more focus, and there we go into F22, and now the house is in really good focus. So that lens, we notice that once we go to a really wide or small f-stop, big f-stop number, small aperture, that we get a lot more depth of field than what we get with telephoto. And that's just because of the physics of how lenses work. The more telephoto you have, the blurrier your background can be. The less telephoto you have, the less blurry your background can be. And so here we are at the 24 to 105 lens, f4. And this, by the way, is one of my favorite macro lenses. It's just easy to hold, easy to carry around. And we have a nice little depth of field right there on that anther. And then here at f8, you notice we've got more depth of field in there, and then more depth of field back here on the flower. And, whoops, I missed one right there. And this is f22. And you see, once again, that background is coming way into focus, where at f4, we didn't have much of the background, but at f22, we do. So you'll see that in everybody's shots. And then here is the 500 millimeter. I misspoke on the first one. So this is 500 millimeters at f7.1. And then here we go to f11. And you notice not much change. And that's because it's the 500 millimeter lens. And then here it goes to f51. And you notice that background is still pretty blurry. And that's simply because We're at we're at 500 millimeters. So the more millimeters we have, the harder it is to blow the background. Excuse me, the more millimeters that we have, the less likely that we're going to be able to see everything when we're at when the high F stops. So good job, Lynette. You pulled that one off really well. And then Christina, here we go with yours. And I'll do the same thing so that we can look at these big time. And I'm going to turn this off so that that doesn't distract from Christina's work. And so Christina, this is your 105 millimeter lens. And this lens goes down to 3.8, so a pretty shallow f-stop. And you notice what a shallow depth of field we have. Look at it. You can see it right there. It's very, very shallow. And then when we go to f8, we see that we've got a lot more depth of field with the 105 millimeter lens. And then when we go to f45, you see that we've got a lot more depth of field. This I'm going to emphasize right now and then continue to emphasize it throughout this class. Just because your lens has a 3.8 or a 1 or a 2 f-stop does not mean we want to use it there, because the depth of field is so shallow. A lens like this 105 is better used at f8 than at that 3.8 because that depth of field is just so shallow. Here comes the 50 millimeter lens. And this has got a great bokeh right here. And we're going to talk about bokeh in today's class. This is 1.8, and you see flat to the film plane. Now we don't notice that shallow depth of field that we noticed in this previous photograph. And that's simply because Christina did exactly right and did flat to the film plane. So if you're going to use that really shallow depth of field, then you need to make sure that you're at really flat to the film plane. Same lens, f8, and you notice that that background is starting to come more in focus. And then 16, now we can see that background a little bit more. So that's a perfect example of flat to the film plane. And then here you go, Christina, we've got again on the 105 millimeter lens, 105 macro lens, f8. Look at that pretty background that we've got, but you gotta be really flat to the film plane to make it work. And then here's 45, f45, lots of nice detail, but look at that background again. Remember, the further the background is away from the subject, the more we're going to be able to blow it out of focus. And with this 105 macro lens, we can really do that. We can still get that creamy background and get our subject in focus. And then here is the f4, and you notice once again that drop off in that lens. It doesn't take long. You can see it right there on the hood of the car. It doesn't take much to get that drop off in that depth of field. Look at it compared to f8. We still get a little bit of drop off, but at f4 we get a lot of drop off. So just be aware of that when you're using that lens. And then here you are again, really nice, flat to the film plane once again, and using the 70 to 210 millimeter lens at 210 millimeters at f4. Beautiful, pure background back here. But then you notice that really shallow depth of field, and it looks like you got a little bit of camera movement in there, maybe kick the tripod or something. No, it's part of the truck. There it is. So it's just coming out there. So my apologies. You didn't kick the truck. You did it just right, Christina. And then here's your f8, looking good once again. And then here's that f32, beautiful background back here, but yet all the grill work on that little tiny truck is in focus. So good job on that one. Nice examples of exactly what I wanted you to realize when you were working on this assignment. So good job on that one. And then here's Lexi's homework. And Lexi did this even more of a challenge than everybody else, because she appears to have gone outside and tried to capture one of these tiny little flowers that we have blowing in the yards right now. When I left this afternoon for a little bit, I noticed that there were some in my yard, and Lexi, I admired you for even attempting to photograph this on this assignment. But here's, once again, your lens over here, 100 millimeters. Here's your depth of field. Here's the shutter speed. And in this case, with that 2.8 at that 100 millimeters, your depth of field is going to be so narrow. It's going to be really, really difficult to capture something out in the field that's blowing around. And they were blowing today, so I assume that they were blowing when you did this. But then we get a really nice picture here. But once again, the depth of field at 2.8, so shallow, you can see it just on the edge of those flowers right there. So very difficult to keep the flower in the frame, much less to try to get it the focus where you want it. This would really need a camera on tripod, no wind, or maybe even bringing the flower inside. And here again at 2.8, once again, just a very shallow depth of field. This is the 100 millimeters again at f8 and focusing over in here. And you see we've got some areas in focus, but not very much. And then here's the 15 to 45 millimeters zoom to 45. And then at 6.3, you'll notice, once again, just such a shallow depth of field, it's very hard to get that subject in focus. And here's another one at 6.3. And then here's another one at 6.3. So just working really hard at trying to get it in focus. But I suspect if you were hand holding that you're moving the camera, because that depth of field is so narrow. And here's that 15 to 45 millimeter lens at f8. Focus is back in here, and you can see a little bit of this petal and this petal right here are in focus, but it's a pretty shallow depth of field when you're trying to use that lens. So the subject really does need to be nice and still. And then you need to be on a tripod as well. And then here we've got a nice shot of that same little flower. And it looks like here that we've got some good detail in focus. So you just have to keep working at it. And then here it goes all the way to 40, f40. And it looks to me like maybe your flash popped up at f40, because you're still staying at 200th of a second throughout all these changes. So it looks like you've got your flash popping up on that one. And then here we've got a good solid depth of field at your f40. But once again, because you didn't change your shutter speed, looks like your flash popped up. And then here we go one more time. Little hard just to get that in focus, especially since it is outside. And then here's your 100 millimeter. It looks like, once again, you didn't quite balance your light meter, because still at 200th of a second at 2.8, but that one's that got pretty shallow depth of field. Here's a pretty one, 28 millimeters, and the f8 and the focus point out here on the flower. And it looks like you've got a good ability to balance the light meter here, because this one's looking pretty nice. And then here we come in again at f8. This one's looking good. You got some nice anthers here in focus at that f8. And then here we go again, trying to get those in focus. This is a really, really difficult little flower to get in focus, especially if we're trying to do it outside. And then here you are, you're still at 200th of a second at f8. And so that's why I think maybe either a flash popped up or we're getting just a little bit on the dark side. This is a pretty one. Shame it's not right in the middle, but it's still pretty. It's got nice depth of field with it. And f8, so that tells you with that 100 millimeter lens, an f8 is a nice f-stop to use on that lens. And then this is a really nice one, once again, at f22 on the 28 millimeter lens. And then here we go again on that 100 millimeter lens. And here we go again. Looks like almost a different camera. Got some sensor dust over there at f32. And then here we go again. Once again, looking like at f32, that 100 millimeter lens is a nice way to go. Lots and lots of sensor dust. So that tells me that that camera needs to have its sensor cleaned. So you tackled something really hard, Lexi, in going outside and trying to photograph that flower versus just bringing it inside. So way to go on your assignment there. Now, Marty, here's Marty's, and we're going to do exactly the same thing with Marty's. Bring them into Camera Raw so that we can look at them big. Here, once again, is your shutter speed, your lens over here on the right, f-stop here, and shutter speed. So this is the 17 to 35 millimeter lens, not flat to the film plane. And notice what a really shallow depth of field it is right in there. So we've got beautiful bokeh on this one, but at 2.8, not much is in focus, not much depth, especially when it's not flat to the film plane. But you take that same lens, shoot it at f8, and look at this beautiful detail right in here on this sand dollar, and still have a beautiful background to it. And then here it is at f22. And this is a super high ISO just to maintain that 250th of a second, but we still have a nice blown out background back there. So still nice bokeh on that. And then here's where you come into flat to the film plane with the 17 to 35, 2.8. Yep, it'll go to 2.8, but there's not much depth of field, even when it's flat to the film plane at 2.8. But then notice how much prettier that looks at f8. So at f8, that 17 to 35 millimeter lens is giving you some nice detail on it, nice crisp edges along here. And then here you go all the way to 22. Once again, we've got some introduced noise, but still has some nice detail in it. And then here, coming down, here's another 85 millimeter, not flat to the film plane. But what's really important about this 85 millimeter macro is look how beautiful that background is. Same background as we've got there, but look how beautiful and blown out that background becomes at that 85 millimeter lens. That's the bokeh of the lens. And then here at that 85 millimeter at 2.8, Marty, you nailed it. You got it absolutely flat to the film plane all the way across. The holes have a lot of detail in them. The edges of the sand dollar have a lot of detail in them. And the background is still beautiful. And then here's f8. And still we've got this really sweet background back here. These last three, Marty, are my favorite because I love the shadow on this sand dollar. This is your 105 macro and gives you an ability to see just how close that macro lens can focus. 4.5, but we've got nice detail in here, nice detail over in these spines. And then look how sweet that background is. That background is just absolutely beautiful. And then we go all the way to f8. Background is still beautiful. The bokeh is still beautiful, but we've still maintained all of those details in that sand dollar. Just absolutely beautiful. And then here we go to f32, had to introduce some high ISO in there. And then we see a little bit of sensor dust also, once again, that we get when we go to those high f-stops. But still the detail is here, and this 105 even at f32 with the background being a long way away, we have a beautiful background. So I like this series just because of this lighting that goes on the side of this sand dollar. So good job on that one, Marty. And then here's Rhonda's. And Rhonda is using, it doesn't show over there on the side. No, it doesn't show over here. So it's not registering on here. I'm going to go by memory and I'm going to scoot down here. So this is the macro lens at starting at f8 as I can see it over there. And you can see that we've got nice depth of field, nice detail in here, but then also we don't have any, but it has a beautiful background to it. So it has a really, really, really nice background to it right through here. And then here we go, a little bit more depth of field, all the little details showing on the little guy. but now the background is becoming a bit more clear. And then here we can see that there's actually a shade back there, but still nice depth of field. And then here going all the way to that depth of field. So keeping it absolutely parallel to the back of the camera, doing a great job. And then here's another one. Once again, the lens isn't showing. So I can't get back to where I was looking before without disrupting this one. So the lens make and model aren't showing right up here, but beautiful blown out background back there. And this shallow depth of field. And then here you go, once again, a little bit more depth of field. So the whole little detail of the little critter, little toy, they're all in focus, all those little edge details, but yet the background is still nice and beautiful. And then this one, I suspect, is your 22 or high f-stop. So good job on that one. And then here's another one. And once again, on another lens, we can see more of the background here. See if I can get a glimpse of what lens this is. It just says, Rhonda just says macro on this lens. So we can see more detail on this one in the background because we can actually see what time it is. And then here we go a little bit more. Here we go a little bit more with that depth of field. And here we go with a little bit more. And then this one right here, obvious. Oh, this is not flat to the film plane. Yeah. So good job on all of those, keeping your meter balanced so all the light look exactly the same. And then not flat to the film plane, shallow depth of field, same lens. And notice how fast that background comes into focus with this lens. But once again, we've got some nice detail showing up in here. And then here we are seeing that background completely at your f/22 or whatever we were using. So very good on doing that exercise. And I'm only seeing the first one was your 200 millimeter lens. I'm seeing that one, Rhonda. So good job on that one. That one's a really nice, good assignment. Sarah, here you come on yours, and we're going to do exactly the same thing on you. Open those up into Adobe Camera Raw so that we can look at them in bigger detail. And this is your 70 to 200 millimeter lens. I love the 70 to 200 millimeter lens. This is a 2.8. Almost all the camera manufacturers make them, and they are known for their beautiful, beautiful backgrounds, the beautiful bokeh in their background. So this is 2.8, and look how shallow that depth of field is, but not so shallow that you wouldn't be able to use this lens, not like we were seeing on some of the other lenses. And then look at f/8, suddenly more of that Gerber daisy, including the stem down here, comes into focus. Notice at 2.8, oh, it was still in focus. There we go. And then here we come all the way to 22, and look at that depth of field at f/22 on this lens. Beautiful. That shows you that this is a really nice macro lens to use. Lots of depth of field at that 200 millimeters f/22, and notice it's a slow shutter speed, so you've got to make sure that that's in a controlled environment. And here's flat to the film plane with the 16 to 35 f/4. Edges of those Gerber daisies, that's pretty good depth of field, as flat as a Gerber daisy is. And then here's f/8. Notice those little creases on that Gerber daisy come into focus even more. And here's f/22. So once again, much, much more detail coming into there. Good job on that one. And then here's the 24 to 105 millimeter lens, and beautiful detail right in here. A little bit of fall off toward the edge at f/4, and that's pretty much what you would expect if you were flat to the film plane on a Gerber daisy, but beautiful detail right in the center here. So Sarah, you kept your focus point exactly where you needed it to be. And then look how much clearer it gets at f/8. Beautiful. And then here's all the way to f/22, same lens, 24 to 105 at 90 millimeters. And notice that beautiful edge all the way around on the flower. So you really did make this nice and flat to the film plane. And then not able to see the background because you kept it far enough away. And then here's the 200 millimeters on the 70 to 210, 2.8. Notice that 2.8 compared to the f4 that we saw earlier. So the 2.8 compared to the f4, let me see if I can do it. Can't remember which one it was. No, must have been on somebody else. There we go. So the 2.8 on that 70 to 200 millimeter, the interior's in focus, but notice that those details along those petals as that kind of arch out. But you go to f8 and now everything's in focus. Beautiful. And then you go to 22 and you definitely have everything in focus. Makes it really, really pretty. Good job, Sarah. Very well done. And maintained your balancing your light meter all the way through. And then here is Susan and working once again on a little sand dollar. There you go. And this is the 24 to 105 millimeter lens at 24. And unfortunately, I can't quite see the ruler there, how far away this is having to focus, but it's at f4. And then here we go, start watching the background as we go to f8. Now you're noticing a little bit more in the background. And then here we go to f22. Notice that you can see the wall detail and other things around there. So this is coming into much more into focus, as well as all the other stuff around. And then here is the 24 to 105 millimeter lens at 50 millimeters. Nice sweet spot for that lens. And look at the beautiful blown out background there. At 4, we've got the edges of the sand dollar, so everything looks really nice and clear and crisp. You kept that absolutely in the plane of focus, Susan, so you did a good job on that one. Here's f8. Look at all that detail in that sand dollar at f8, but yet the background is still pretty much out of focus. And then here we go at f22. Look at the magnificent detail. You did a great job on that one, Susan, keeping all that sand dollar in detail. And then here is the 24 to 105. Once again, just at f4 and at 105. Look at the detail in that at f22. So just super, super strong detail in that sand dollar at f22. But the background's still out of focus, which is great. And then here's that same lens, 24 to 105. Sorry, I didn't put those in the right order, but here's f4 at 105, f22 at 105, and then here is f4 at 105 again. And then here's f4 at 8. I think this is not flat to the film plane because we're seeing some drop off down in that area at the top. And then here's the 105 at f8. So sorry, I didn't put those in the right order. And here's your not flat to the film plane at f22. But at f22, notice how much depth of field you do have. With just that slight bit of tilting back, you're able to keep it all in focus. So I want to commend each one of you for doing your homework assignment. Thank you very much for doing your homework assignment. You did a great job. And that was really nice to see you all do. And see that my camera's gone out of focus. There we go. So that was really nice to see you all do all that work. And unfortunately, I don't get to hear about your trials and tribulations. That's always the fun part of hearing about your trials and tribulations as you were trying to work on the assignment. I'll get to hear those next week. So now I'm going to share the screen with you again and work on our items for this class. So I wanted to remind you, there you go, to watch your histogram when you're doing macro work, because sometimes we get so caught up in doing the tiny detail and trying to keep everything flat to the film plane and trying to keep everything from moving and all of that stuff that we forget to look at the histogram. So watch that histogram. As long as the histogram goes all the way across, that's a fine picture. That's okay. We've captured all the data. This top histogram, I should have gone ahead and overexposed just a little bit more. And then that would have given me my white details a bit more. The bottom histogram, tail goes all the way to the right corner, which is the whites. Tail goes all the way to the left corner, which is the blacks. So a histogram that touches both corners is a good histogram. I don't care how many peaks and valleys it has, because those are all just the different colors in a photograph. A histogram just shows us from black to white, blackest black to purest white. It's a graph of all 256 possible black and white tones. So we should be paying attention to that histogram every single time. We want it to go all the way across and hit each corner, the white corner and the black corner. This little going off the top of the histogram is important when we're doing macro work, because that's showing us that some of the colors have been overexposed. So once again, we might need to do a little bit of fiddling on that exposure. If we overexpose a little bit, maybe this will go down just a little bit, but we got to be careful on that one. We'll talk about that as time goes on. And then your bokeh. You've heard me mention bokeh. And bokeh is the smoothness of the background. It comes from a Japanese word meaning blurry. And so each lens has its own bokeh, its own blown out background, its own smoothness to the background. And when you're buying a lens, you'll hear people say it has a magnificent bokeh. Well, that means that, as you saw in some of the homework assignments, some lenses give you a super smooth background, and some lenses, it's not as smooth. So it's all based on the quality of the lens. The more sheets that are in the aperture, the better your circle will be. The more sheets are in the aperture, the more expensive your lens is going to be. And so you end up getting what you're paying for. It's also based on distance to the subject. The closer you are to the subject, the more you can blow your background out of focus. It's also based on your angle to the camera. And then it is also based on your aperture opening. So each aperture opening, if we're really closed down, we're going to get a lot of blurring. If we're opened back up, which would be your f/22 or 45, then we're going to get less blurring. And this is an example of angle to the subject. This is where I'm tilting the camera ever so slightly to create those little cat eyes. So a flat to the film plane would create the round circle, but if I tilted the lens, then I'm going to get more of that kind of cat eye in there. By the way, this is just a whole bunch of Christmas lights strung up at the end of a closet. And then I put the coffee mug on a coffee table, on a card table at the front of the closet. And then those little Christmas lights blew all out of focus. So that's all that photograph is. So your f-stop depends on how much bokeh you're going to get, how much blurry background you're going to get. 24 to 105 millimeter lens, f4, focusing on just the edge of this glass, gives me that blown out background, but f/22 gives me that softness of the background. So what photograph you are trying to create, it depends on what f-stop you are using. If I'm using a shallow f-stop like this f4, then I better make sure that this isn't a living, breathing subject and I'm not hand-holding the camera. This is something where if we want it to be precise, we're going to end up having to be on a tripod. So here's a 50 millimeter lens, and some of you all use that, and this is at f/14. And so you've already seen examples in your homework assignments of where it's better to use your wider f-stops, your 14s or your 22s on some of these lenses versus your shallows. Watch this shallow. That's 4.5 on this 50 millimeter. And then that is 1.5 on this 50 millimeter lens. So going all the way back, if I want to photograph that flower and bring out that detail in that flower, then I'm going to shoot this flower at an f/14. And, 4.5 gives me a different artistic effect, but 1.5 is going to be very difficult to manage. Once again, no wind, camera's on tripod, subject is locked down. Also depends on your lens. So this is a 300 millimeter f4 lens. Canon, Nikon, Sony, Olympus, everybody made one of these or has made one of these for digital SLRs. I'm waiting for this one for mirrorless because it really is a sweet lens. I enjoyed using it. So this is the 300 millimeter f29. And that's the background on it. And look, we've got all the detail throughout on the flower, on that fuchsia. But then this is what happens when I'm at 5.6. And you notice the front part of the flower is now out of focus. The anthers down in here are in focus, but the front part is out of focus. Where if I wanted that front part to be in focus, then it's moving down to the 29. So I still get this beautiful background. That's what that lens was known for, was this beautiful blurry background. But we've got to be careful in shooting it at 5.6 because it's got a really shallow depth of field. This is the 300 millimeter lens again at f4 and photographed at f4. If the subject is flat to the film plane, as we saw in your homework assignments, f4 is perfectly fine. But we've got to make sure that we're absolutely flat to the film plane. And this was done in the field, but I'm holding the camera steady and I'm also making sure that I'm absolutely flat to that fern leaf. 100 to 400 millimeter lens at f8. It comes at f8. So, you know, it doesn't come at f8. That I spoke wrong on that one. But at f8 on it, that f8 is exactly the right amount when we've zoomed out to 400 millimeters. Here it is again at f8 for a small little red-eyed tree frog, 1.5 inches long. f8, that's exactly what I need if I've got that lens zoomed out to 500 or 400. So how much depth of field we get with each one of our f-stops, this is what I like to think of as you knowing your tools. A lens is a tool. Canon, Nikon, Olympus, Sony did not make a lens just for the heck of it. They made it because it does something specific. It's a tool. So you need to get to the point where you know that if you pull out your 105 macro lens and you use f8, then you're going to have so much depth of field if you're so far away from your subject. So you need to get to where you know your lenses as tools. Which one do I need to pull out of the bag to do what I want it to do? Also, get used to using that depth of field preview button on those of you still using the digital SLRs. You push that depth of field preview button. You put your hands around the viewfinder to let your eyes adjust to the light. The view is going to go dark. And when it goes dark, you can actually see how much depth of field you have. So you can see where you need to focus, what f-stop you need to use. And by the way, you can change your focus while you're looking through that with that depth of field preview button, and you can change your f-stop. So you can figure out exactly where you need to focus to get foreground in focus to background in focus on your little bitty subject. And that's your depth of field preview button. Mirrorless cameras, we see it right through the viewfinder. So we can see right through the viewfinder how much depth of field we actually have. So it's an advantage to using the mirrorless cameras. Okay, now's when I would stop and I would ask you if you have any questions. And unfortunately, I can't stop and ask you if you have any questions because you're not here. So now it's time for me to go on to focus stacking. This is one way that we can minimize that shallow depth of field is through focus stacking. So what focus stacking is where we're going to focus in various areas of the photograph. Close up, middle, far, close up, close up, close up. And then we're going to stack them on top of each other. So here is a little, whoops, go back to that. Here's a little video. I think it's going to run. Let me go all the way back. see what it's doing. Oh, there it is right there. That's what I was looking for. Now watch, here's the video. Just these are all the pieces that I used. And then I stacked them at the end. So you see all the different little places that I focused throughout that sotol. So here, for instance, is just a sweet example, simple example of focus stacking on this peacock feather. So it's up against a black background. It's up here in my office. And then I just used like, you know, an F8 or something like that. And then I took another photograph of it and I focused here and then here and 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 here, because it's slightly leaning backwards. And then I stacked them on top of each other. So a simple F8 looks like that. A bunch of F8s focus stacked look like that. So focus stacking is a way that we can get all of the subject in focus by blending a whole bunch of photographs. So this is a blend of 6 different images, and you see the way that this Bouvardia blooms. It's got little small flowers on it, but they all go in different directions. So this was always a flower that drove me crazy because it was very difficult to get in focus. So with focus stacking, though, solve the problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on each one of the little blooms, and then I'm going to blend them all together. So you can look at it real close and you can see that I've missed a couple of little spots in there. That's typical in focus stacking. But here's one photo where it looks like I focused on these 2 flowers right here, or one of those 2 flowers. Here's one where I focused on that flower. Here's one where it looks like I focused on that flower or that flower. Here's another one where it looks like I focused maybe on this flower this time. I need to get that one in the back. There we go. So I focused here and I focused here on this one. And then one of them all the way at F22 just to give me even more depth of field, or hopefully to give me more depth of field. And then when I stack them all together, then I get lots and lots of depth of field. This is a little fatal metal mark butterfly. Is about so big, about 1 inch across. I found it in the desert one day. It was super hot, and I didn't want to walk across the parking lot, asphalt parking lot, to get my tripod. So I just decided, what the heck, I'm just going to do focus stacking. So this is my 300 millimeter lens f4. And I took one photograph and focused on each wing and each edge of each wing, and then one on the body, and then one on the tail. Now I'm holding this camera and just trying not to move the camera, but just moving the focus point around. And then the software blends it. And I've given you instructions on how to do it in the handout. So even if you move ever so slightly, the software takes that into account. Here is a blend of 2 images, and these are just 2 images that I found in my files. I photographed this little butterfly. One of the shots, the wings looked good, and one of the shots, the wings looked, you know, not as good. I'm going to go back to the blending one. And when I blended them both together, so it wasn't an intentional focus blend. It was just that when I photographed the little butterfly, I got 2 shots that were sort of good, but neither one of them was really good. And then when I blended them together, then now I get nice sharp details on those wings. I did have to do some work on the antennas, and I'll warn you on butterflies and moths that many times you do have to do some work on those little antennas because the butterflies are moving them all the time. Here is several images blended together of the coronated tree frog. And this was intentionally done as a focus stack because I knew how small he was. And it was, and then several of them were blended together. Here's another one of a small little tree frog, once again about so big, in Costa Rica, and I blended it together. This was not an intentional blend. I just took a whole bunch of pictures of this frog with shallow depth of field, and none of them came out really good. So I blended them all together and I got one that looked good. So, I was able to salvage that shoot. And then here is another focus stack of a tiny little dayflower. We'll see these coming into bloom shortly out in the yard. It's a difficult three-dimensional flower. There is nothing flat to the film plane, like in the frogs or the butterflies. I've got frogs, the eyes, and butterflies, the wings. But this little dayflower, I don't have anything that's flat to the film plane. So I brought it inside, added an artificial background, and then started at the tip and just photograph, moving the focus. And I wish I would have moved the focus all the way to the end and completed the series, but I didn't. This is another focus stack done of the long-tailed skipper. Small little butterfly, once again, difficult to photograph, but I set the camera. So many of your mirrorless cameras have focus stacking right in the camera body. I set the camera for focus stacking and then fired away. And this is probably 5 or 6 shots. Lesson learned on this focus stacking in the camera: make sure your beginning focus point is the closest place to you in the photograph. So my first focus point should have been on the tip of the wing that's closest to the camera. Lesson learned there. Here's a Gulf fritillary, not a hard butterfly to photograph, but sometimes it's hard to get that depth of field as well as that blown out background. And so this is a series of 6 images done at a very shallow depth of field, say like, an f8 on the 100 to 500 millimeter lens with a 1.4x extender, making it 700 millimeters. So that makes your depth of field super, super shallow. Here is another idea that you can do with a focus stack. This is just a little Peruvian lily from the grocery store, but it also is just photographed all the way through. So just, a nice little focus point moving all the way through. You can do the same thing with snowflakes. And by the way, that's how you have to do snowflakes. So this ended up being about 10 images that were then focus stacked. And then here's a series that I'm working on during the springtime. I'm on my 2nd year of this, and I'm photographing catkins on trees in the neighborhood. And, there's a stem coming here and a leaf going there. And so this is a very difficult depth of field and still being able to keep the background blurry. So this is started out just doing it focus here, focus here, focus here, focus here, focus here, focus here, just focusing on various places on this catkin. I bring it inside to keep the wind from blowing it and make sure it's all in the composition that I want it. You could do the same thing with an in-camera focus stacking. So you could do the same thing, but remember, just focus on the area closest to you first, and that's where you start so that your focus stack goes backwards. Here's some more of my little tree buds that I'm working on, just a series of images that I'm working on as the years go on. And then here's another focus stack on one of those long-tailed skippers. And this one, I did focus on the wing closest to me because he holds his wings in a really peculiar fashion. Skippers do in the butterfly world. So I made sure to start my focus stack in the camera on the part of the wing that was closest to me. And this is about 10 shots. How deep you set your focus stack is up to you and your camera. If it's a small subject, don't set it too deep. If it's a large subject, you can set it deeper. But in a critter like this long-tailed skipper, I don't have very deep. And depending on whether you want to do 6 shots or 9 shots or 10 shots, that's up to you. It just depends on how many photos you want to process. So you just have to work with it. I blew it up so that you can see it and you can see the detail that we get when we do a focus stack and still keep that beautiful background to it. This is a blend of 10 images with the in-camera focus stacking. And you'll notice right down in here, because I'm hand holding the camera and there's a little bit of movement from the wind, that it made some mistakes, the software did, when it stacked the images. So here's another one right over here. Here's another one right here. So you've got to be aware that software does make mistakes. Sometimes you just have to redo it. And then here's not blended at f11, and here's blended at 10 images. So it gives you an idea of how much depth of field we can get when we do this focus stacking in the camera. Here's just a goofy picture, focus stacking automatic. So just, working on focus, on one of these pine cones and let it go with an artificial background. This is also focus stacking up and down. So starting with the top subject and focus down. Somebody asked me if it would work, so I thought I'd try it, because I always think of focus stacking as going through the image versus top to bottom. So just a little bit different. Here's 7 points. So all I did was I focused on this little guy, Alice, them. So I just focused on 7 points in there and then focus stacked them. So I did the focusing on this one versus letting it do an auto on the focus stacking. Here's something that you can play with too on your focus stacking. This is the focus stack of the Peruvian lily that I showed you just a little bit ago, but one of the layers, I blurred it. And so when I was working in the layers in Photoshop, then I just blurred it with the Gaussian blur. And that gave me this kind of dreamy look to it. So something for you to try. And here's a mineral or a gem that somebody brought in to play with. And this was when I was working with the Olympus cameras and testing them. And this is a focus stack. Great detail here in the front. Good detail here in the middle. And I wish that I would have concentrated a little bit more on getting all that detail in the background. So I didn't set it for enough photographs to take or enough depth to take. This is where you got to know your camera and what it does and how it operates on focus stacking. How shallow are things? How deep are things? You just got to play. Just sit there and shoot a whole bunch of pictures, of something like this in your office. And then here's an Olympus in-camera focus stack. Some of your mirrorless cameras, or one of the options in your mirrorless cameras, is it says, do you want the camera to stack these? Okay, yeah, that'd be a good deal. And that's what Olympus did here. It focus stacked it for me. And then here we see a little bitty error, but not too much. And then another one of your options on your cameras doing focus stacking is it'll say, do you want me to focus stack them, the camera, and do you want me to throw away the pieces or keep the pieces? If you throw away the pieces, then you're not going to be able to focus stack later on in Lightroom or Photoshop if you think that that's going to give you a better picture. So I always like to keep the pieces, even if I tell the camera to go ahead and do the focus stacking. Some cameras are amazing on this focus stacking. Olympus came out with this several years ago and really nailed it. So it just depends on which camera manufacturer you're using, how well they can blend all the photos in the camera versus how well you can blend them later on. If you're going to do precise slices, so when you do your focus stacking, then that's where you're going to need to use that focus rail that I showed you last week. Because then you can rotate the knob and get absolutely precise slices through your subject. I saw some photographs when we were in Costa Rica recently of some minerals, a mineral collection that a photographer had photographed, and they are exquisite. The backgrounds are absolutely amazing. Most of them were done on mirrors, so it was beautiful. But I'm sure that they used a focusing rail because it just allows for that really, really precision. to make sure you're getting all your slices and you're getting your slices just right. So this focusing rail is very handy to have. You've got either in camera where it's doing it, you've got manual focusing where you're doing it, or if you want to get super, super precise, then you've got this focusing rail. So I hope that that helps you out just a bit on focus stacking. Now, water drops. This is your next thing that we're going to work on, and you need to get a piece of glass. And I'm sure you have a frame somewhere in your house that has a piece of glass in it that's the frame's not being used. Take that piece of glass out, clean it really, really good, get all the smudges and all the imperfections off of it, not imperfections, but get all the smudges and the dirt off of it, and then get some Rain-X and spray Rain-X on it, and Rain-X will allow the water to form really nice balls. You notice that I didn't clean my glass really well. Here's little pieces of hair running all the way through it. And I didn't use Rain-X, which is why my little drops are not absolutely precise little drops. So use Rain-X, and then you can either squirt the glass, the drops on the glass, and you can use a very fine tweezer or toothpick, and you can run the drops together. You can move the drops around so that they get bigger and that they're in the position you want them, or you can just do it at random. And what you're trying to illustrate with this is that on every single subject in nature, it has a way that it drains water. So this dandelion from up in Minnesota accumulates water drops, morning dew, rain, on these very, very tiny little fibers on each one of those strands. And it forms these beautiful little, beautiful balls on them. You've seen this on things like spider webs, for instance, but this is called your micropapier, if I'm pronouncing that right. And it's the way that each subject in nature drains water off of it. And it's absolutely beautiful. So on these lotus flowers, for instance, you can see that the top of when the rain gets on them, these lotus buds, it makes these beautiful balls that almost look like liquid mercury. So every subject in nature has a way that it drains water. So you're going to go looking for that. You can either squirt the water on it, or you can go out and find it for real out in the field. So here it is on a calla lily in Costa Rica. The morning dew in the tropical rainforest accumulates, and it forms these beautiful drops as the water is shed in the early morning off of that flower. So this is that micropapier that every one of the subjects in nature has a way of it draining water. So from previous students, I thought I'd just give you some ideas from previous students on their glass covered with Rain-X and then squirted with water. So this is a piece of wrapping paper behind the glass. So in your homework assignment, what you are going to do is you are going to suspend your piece of glass between two objects, maybe two chairs, or maybe two tall cans, or maybe two tall containers. And then you're going to put your background down on the floor or at the base of those cans if you're going to suspend it over cans. I also have a glass table that I use for this. And then that way, that glass table, it's an old end table that has a glass insert in it. I can put things underneath that insert, squirt it with Rain-X, make nice little balls. So how blurry your background is going to depend on how far away your subject is from your background. Here's another one. And you see that she was very precise with this one. And on the Rain-X glass, she just used an eyedropper, very tiny eyedropper, and she made the heart with each drop of water, and then cleaned up all the mess she had, of course. And then once again, a piece of wrapping paper or a blouse or a scarf or something back there. I thought that was real clever. Here's another one doing roughly the same thing, but a cute little background, interesting background to make the photograph. And another one, once again, cleaning up some of those bubbles, making those bubbles a bit more precise, or drops of water, making them a bit more precise. This is a great thing you can do inside. You don't have to go outside for doing this one at all. And then here's another one that I really like. It's a fan underneath there, you know, one of those decorative fans. But you see up here, we're seeing the yellow of the fan, and down here, we're seeing another part of the fan. And Sarah, you will remember this from the class we were in. I showed this one there. And then here's an example of those water drops in nature. So someone just squirted some water on one of their succulents and then watched how the water dripped off of it. Now, you know, don't squirt something, a plant, and get it too wet, because then you won't notice this way that it's shedding water because it's totally drenched. So sometimes it just takes a tiny little bit. I've noticed it on caladiums, and then I noticed it on something out front the other day when I was leaving the house. I think it was one of the bulbs that was coming up. So look around in nature and find out, see if you can find where some of the water is beading. So your homework assignment is you're going to try your hand at focus stacking, photograph the same subject, but focus in a different place in each shot. Suggest 6 or 7 photos for focus stacking, and you're going to present the finished image to the class. You're going to spray a piece of glass with Rain-X or other water-beading product. Place flowers, M&Ms, or other colorful objects behind the glass, and then focus on the bead of water. Sometimes, by the way, if your beads are rather tall, the focus point is difficult. Do you focus on the top of the bead of the water, the middle of the bead of the water, or do you focus on the bead where it hits the glass? See what you can find out. And then photograph a bead of water on a flower or a leaf. And can you capture an interesting reflection in that bead of water? See what you can do with that one. So that's your homework assignment for next week. You're going to try your hand at focus stacking. You're going to spray a piece of glass with Rain-X or other water beading product, and you're going to photograph things through those water drops. And then you're going to go outside in nature and see if you can photograph a bead of water on a flower or on a leaf. Don't feel like you've got to go any place other than your own yard, or your own house plants that are in your house. Just look around, see what you can find. I look forward to seeing your homework next week. I look forward to seeing your face next week, and hopefully we get to see each other face to face. If you've got any questions, send them to me via email, and I'll gladly answer them for you. And otherwise, I will, camera's still focusing silly. There it goes. Otherwise, I will see you next week on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock in class. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them to me via email. If they are interesting and need to be shared with the class, by the way, I'll share them with the class. Thanks very much for tolerating me this morning and for watching the video. I appreciate it. See you next week.